Welcome to the Power of Food podcast. We are so excited to bring you evidence-based nutrition information focusing on addressing the root cause for imbalance. Food has the power to help you achieve lifelong optimal health without the side effects of prescription medication. Subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or any other podcast platform. I am Stacy Seslowski, functional nutrition registered dietitian.
And I am Leah Grace Barrick, functional nutritionist.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Power of Food podcast number 6. We're so excited to be here with you guys today and talk about a topic that we've been wanting to cover since the beginning, and that is gluten. And you have probably heard of someone in your life going gluten-free or gluten not being good for a variety of reasons. And so we just kind of wanted to do an overview of this topic and help give some clarity about it and answer some common questions that we get about gluten because it has become a big buzzword. And so a lot of people are wondering if it's a fad diet, if it's substantiated, who should go gluten-free, is it actually healthier, all of these things. So Stacy and I are here today to debunk all of that and answer all the questions and really dive deep into gluten.
Yeah, I'm really excited for this topic as well. It's just funny, like, I just remember growing up, I never even heard of gluten. It just wasn't even a thing. And then now I feel like it's everywhere and every food is marketed as gluten-free. And it's like, why? You know, what is this? Where does it come from? And should everyone eliminate it from their diet? So I'm excited to get into these details today.
Yeah, definitely. Even restaurants are now, having gluten-free menus, which is really interesting to see, even smaller restaurants. And, the number of Americans going gluten-free has tripled since 2009. And so I think the statistics now are about 1 in 5 people are choosing to avoid gluten. So this is definitely a big topic. So let's just dive right in.
Sounds good. So our first idea, just to introduce the topic, was to talk about what is gluten. So what is it? The way that I describe it is just that it's a type of protein that really forms as wheat or some other types of grains like barley and rye, oats if they're not called or labeled gluten-free, and then also spelt. So it's a type of protein that forms when these types of grains are cultivated. And unfortunately, there are some people that would be considered celiac, people that have celiac disease, and we'll get into the details more as we go, but that they are completely intolerant of gluten. And then there are some people who just have an intolerance to gluten. And we're going to talk about why some people would be intolerant of this type of protein and why some people would be just having to completely eliminate it from their diet 100%.
Yeah, definitely. And so gluten is a protein. And so it's kind of a cohesive and elastic protein, and it helps make bread soft and pliable, if you think about it like that. And that's why gluten-free baking can be so hard for people. But it's also made up of other proteins called gliadin and glutenin too. So we often say gluten, and oftentimes we're actually meaning gliadin, which is the protein that actually triggers an immune response in some people. So just to give a little bit of clarity about that. And as you mentioned, Stacy, it's, in grains that are gluten containing, so wheat, barley, rye, spelt, even things like couscous, which people often don't realize actually does have gluten. So it's good to know where gluten's hiding. There's other sources, which we can talk about later, where you might not think gluten would be in, but are. So it's important to just be aware of that.
Absolutely. I think what's also interesting is that These types of grains and the protein that they form, so gluten, was really domesticated and began in our history just about 5 to 12,000 years ago. And when you think about the relative age of human beings and our world, it's way longer than that. So it's relatively new ingredient that has been introduced to human beings. And when something is new, it is recognized as foreign to our bodies. And when something is recognized as foreign, we've had a lot of podcasts in the past about inflammation, but basically when something is foreign to our bodies, it can be treated just like a germ or a toxin, if we ingest or inhale a toxin, or even an injury. All of those things are sources of inflammation. And when we ingest something that is foreign, it will cause the same type of inflammatory response. So that is why anything that's like brand new, and you think about processed foods, similarly, when something is processed, it has changed from the time that it was found in nature till the time it ends up on your table in the kitchen. Same idea. When you've changed a food from its natural form, it can also be recognized as foreign and can also create an inflammatory response in the body.
Yeah, absolutely. And like you mentioned, grains in general being, relatively new. And also if we look at how these grains are cultivated, so how they're grown, genetic modification plays a role, and the toxic chemicals that we put on them to grow, that also has a role. And that might be part of the reason why we see so many more problems with gluten in America, especially compared to when we're looking at Europe, where they don't have GMO crops, and the glyphosate is way more regulated, and so all of that can make the whole issue that much worse.
Absolutely. I'm so glad you mentioned glyphosate, because that is used pre-harvest for most of our grains. And so if people are having an intolerance to these foods, it is very hard to decipher, is it because of gluten or is it because of the glyphosate and other pesticides that are being used for these foods? So sometimes I know for myself, one of the reasons that I actually do prefer to reduce gluten in my diet is more so because of the glyphosate that I know is being used, rather than the fact that I know I can't tolerate gluten, which is actually not the case for me. Okay. So,
all right.
The next topic we thought we would discuss is gluten harmful for everyone?
Yeah, so this is asked a lot to me, and I'm sure you as well, Stacy, because like I mentioned in the beginning, a lot of people are hesitant to go gluten-free if they think it's just a fad diet, or they think it might not be bothersome for them. And so essentially, I like to think of problems with gluten in two different categories. So we have celiac disease, and then we have non-celiac gluten sensitivity. And so celiac disease, I'm sure most people have heard of it, but it affects about 1% of the population, and it's actually an autoimmune reaction. So to understand this, it's a little bit helpful to understand that the gut lining, we've talked about this before, but essentially it's like a cheesecloth. So it's a single layer of cells, and it's selectively permeable. So it's supposed to let in, the things that we're supposed to absorb and nutrients. But if that is, if there's something causing leaky gut, or the villi in the small intestine, which are the projections, so it's like little projections that help us absorb, if those are, if gluten is in the body of someone with celiac, it actually it's like a sandpaper is how I like to think of it. It gets rid of those projections, and it actually is the body attacking itself because it doesn't recognize this foreign gluten protein, and that can cause a whole host of problems. So with someone with celiac, they can't ever have gluten. It's 100%. white and black really can't do gluten. It causes a ton of issues. But then there's something that's a little bit more complicated, which is non-celiac gluten sensitivity. So do you want to talk a little bit about that, Stacy? It's not as, it's a little bit more recent, I would say, in the literature, and people are just kind of starting to find out about it, but it's definitely an important topic.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're right, it is more complicated because there isn't any definitive test that you can take that tells you that you have a bit of a sensitivity towards gluten. Whereas for celiac, you can test for the antibodies and you can definitely determine that you have it. For its sensitivity or an intolerance to gluten, it's much harder to definitively find. But unfortunately, gluten does have, just like you said, the gut is surrounded by this membrane that is similar to cheesecloth. So if you can imagine all those little holes that's found in cheesecloth, unfortunately, when those little holes become bigger and bigger, undigested food will escape the gut rather than getting digested and going down into our small and then large intestine and then being excreted. More and more foods are able to escape these holes in the gut, in the intestinal wall, and get into our blood. And when food gets into our blood, food that doesn't belong there will cause an inflammatory response, just like I talked about before, because the body recognizes something in the blood that shouldn't be there, and immune cells are sent to that compound to get rid of it, and that's inflammation. So unfortunately, gluten has the ability to sort of cause those holes to get those holes in the cheesecloth to get bigger and bigger. And gluten does have the ability to escape the gut more so than other foods and enter the blood and cause inflammation. So, when you have this type of intolerance or sensitivity to gluten and it does cause this inflammatory response, it's not always completely obvious, because the symptoms that it may result could be headaches or mood disturbances or joint pain. And many people that experience these types of symptoms, they don't necessarily correlate it to, oh, well, it's because I'm eating gluten. So it takes a lot of trial and error, including weeks sometimes, to eliminate gluten from the diet and see if those symptoms go away, as a means of learning if you are one of these people that has this type of sensitivity.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the hard part with this also is that it's not the kind of thing where you eat gluten and immediately you get symptoms. It's not like an allergy like that, which is a lot easier to identify. You could be getting symptoms hours later, days later. And so it's much harder to correlate and figure out, okay, I had gluten and that is what's causing these issues. And again, it might not just be gastrointestinal issues like bloating or altered bowel function. It could also be skin manifestations, headaches, fatigue, joint pain, and it could manifest days later. So really the best way to go about seeing if you are sensitive and if you are having problems is to do an elimination diet and take gluten out of your diet for however long, do a gut healing protocol, and then eventually add gluten back in and see if those symptoms come back. And so that's a really good way to know. As we mentioned, if you do have celiac, that can be tested with antibody tests and a biopsy, so 100%. But non-celiac gluten sensitivity is a lot harder, and typically an elimination diet is the best way to go about seeing if that is causing issues for you.
Yeah, exactly. And along those same lines is you may have been able to tolerate gluten for most of your life. And then all of a sudden at a certain age, your body begins to become more sensitive to to eating it. And then all of a sudden, so this could happen later on in life. It doesn't mean that, that it's not gluten just because you've been able to tolerate gluten for your whole life. It's still something to consider, even if this is happening later on.
100%. And, some research is showing that gluten, even in people without, non-celiac gluten sensitivity, which it's estimated, I believe about 6% of the population has, and they have symptoms. There's research suggesting that anyone, even if you don't have that, even if you don't have celiac disease, anyone eating gluten experiences intestinal permeability following consumption of gluten. So that means if you're eating gluten, you could be doing this to yourself even though you're not directly feeling these symptoms. And then, as we've talked about in the past, leaky gut or intestinal permeability can set you up for a host of other problems, including autoimmune disease is a big one. So it's really important to realize that even though you might not be experiencing these overt symptoms, it still could be causing inflammation in your body, and you still might want to be wary of it. And also, as you mentioned, you might not have had a problem with gluten in the past, but there are so many other factors that can contribute to leaky gut or intestinal permeability. So like stress is a big one. And so it's not like gluten is the only thing that we're doing to ourselves, that would cause leaky gut. It's this combination of so many different factors. So it makes it much more of an issue.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. And it could be a situation like there's a perfect storm where gluten is causing a little bit of that leaky gut, but then in combination with a stressful event, lack of sleep, nutrient deficiencies, that combination of those things happening all at once could then make gluten show its face really and show why it's a problem. But I'm also really happy that you brought up autoimmunity, because if we go back to the question of should everybody be removing gluten, we could argue yes or no, depending on, like you said, it really does increase intestinal permeability. It has glyphosate in it. So for those reasons, possibly many people should consider removing it. However, I would say that people with autoimmune conditions, whether it be a thyroid problem, a condition, or rheumatoid arthritis, or MS, or any other autoimmune condition, I would say yes, everyone with an autoimmune condition should remove gluten. And that's because having a leaky gut is highly correlated to those autoimmune conditions. And we are trying to remove every trigger of inflammation in people with autoimmune condition, because any trigger for inflammation will then attack your self-tissue, whether it's your thyroid, your joints, or whatever autoimmune condition you have. So if you do have an autoimmune condition, and let me know what you think on this topic, I would say yes, you should definitely remove gluten for those people.
Yeah, I do totally agree with that. And I would also add, even if you don't have the autoimmune condition yet and you do have genetic susceptibility, so someone in your family, whether it's a parent or a grandparent or even a sibling, I would also recommend that person avoid gluten as well, because it can still increase your risk of developing autoimmune disease, especially if you have genetic susceptibility.
Exactly. Completely agree with that. Okay, so if you are going to eliminate gluten, what are some considerations that we should keep in mind?
Yeah, so I love this topic because a lot of people think that a gluten-free diet is a healthy diet, and that is not necessarily the case, because unfortunately, anytime there is a health fad, the large companies and the marketers get on board and they decide to make all of the processed foods suddenly gluten-free and make it appear that they are healthier. So even though a food is labeled gluten-free, oftentimes it's heavily processed. They end up adding in tons of preservatives and gums and things to make it, feel like gluten, look like gluten, which are probably just as bad for us in a lot of ways. So it's important to do a whole foods gluten-free diet if you are going gluten-free. So, focus on your fruits, vegetables, gluten-free grains if you tolerate them, legumes, good sources of protein, healthy fat, just like everything we talk about. And then the other consideration that I like to just kind of let people know if they are going gluten-free is that a lot of these processed foods that are making these gluten-free products, they're really filled with rice. So a lot of rice, and people end up consuming so much rice, and there's a lot of arsenic in rice. So I like to let people know that just because that can cause a lot of health issues as well. And we want to try to avoid those heavy metals in our diet as much as we can. So you'll notice like hamburger buns that are gluten-free are rice flour based, and so many different things. You know, you could go to the gluten-free section of your grocery store, and the chances of a lot of those foods and pastas and breads are rice flour based. So I like to make people aware of that as well. So what about you, Stacy? What are some things you like to tell people about when they're going gluten-free?
Yeah, I 100% agree with what you said. Just because a food is marketed gluten-free does not mean that it's healthy. But also, I like to mention that eating whole grains, which do have gluten, also does offer us a really good source of fiber in our diet. So if you are eliminating whole grains and other wheat products that do contain gluten, then fiber has to be replaced from alternative foods. So just like you said, all the legumes and nuts and seeds and fruits and vegetables, and all those foods that replace fiber in our diet have to be included. And the best way to do it is you want to aim for about 30 to 40 grams of fiber per day. And if you really want to learn exactly how much fiber you're consuming, then I think maybe we've recommended this before, but there are several apps where you can write down or identify all the foods that you're eating throughout the day, and it will tell you exactly how much fiber you have consumed in one day. So it may help if you are going to eliminate gluten from your diet, that you might want to calculate exactly how much fiber you're eating, just to make sure that you are replacing that important nutrient in your diet.
Yeah, such a good point. And also going off grains, if you are consuming, gluten-free grains, you want to make sure that they're certified gluten-free. So for example, especially oats inherently don't have gluten, but they are susceptible to cross-contamination. So they're either grown in fields that are next to gluten-containing grains, or, they're processed on machines that also process gluten grains. If you're really trying to be super strict and go 100% gluten-free, I always tell people to opt for the certified gluten-free label so you can be 100% sure. And then the other thing to consider is that gluten is hiding in a lot of places that you wouldn't think. So things like soy sauce, teriyaki sauce, bouillon cubes, veggie burgers, a lot of candies, which again, you shouldn't be eating these anyways, but just to be aware, and some ground spices. So I know some za'atar has gluten in it. French fries can have gluten, cold cuts, different condiments. So just, educating yourself and figuring out places where gluten might be hiding that you're not thinking about, especially if you're trying to do an elimination diet, to really find out if gluten is a trigger for you.
Yeah. And especially because for those people who have an autoimmune condition or celiac disease, even just the tiniest little bite or taste of gluten will trigger that inflammatory response. So it doesn't have to be, an entire piece of bread, or it could literally just be like you tasted something that was cooked in oil that had gluten in it at some point, and your body will recognize it, have an inflammatory response. And so I know some people say, well, I only had a little. But if you are really trying to figure out how your body does with or without gluten, or if you have an autoimmune condition or celiac disease, then even just the tiniest bite of it will trigger that response. So it is all that you search for. And there's a website. Do you remember, is it celiac? There's a website that gives, and we could put it in the show notes, but that lists out all the possible places that you can find gluten. So if you're really trying to eliminate it, then that's a good resource.
Yeah, totally. We can definitely put that in the show show notes because that can be really helpful for people. But if you are, I just want to mention really quick, if you know you don't have celiac disease and you're pretty sure you don't have non-celiac gluten sensitivity, and you do want to eat a little bit of gluten, typically I tell people, make sure your gut is in tip-top shape. So make sure the rest of your diet is anti-inflammatory and you're not promoting inflammation. And then always go for organic. So like we talked about in the beginning, wheat is really heavily processed. So if you want a little bit of gluten, typically what I'll recommend is organic sourdough bread, because the sourdough process, it's a fermentation process and it actually helps break down the gluten. So if you find a place, I know there's, local bakeries everywhere who are doing this, which is awesome. And they do a traditional fermentation for their sourdough. That is typically the best option if you're going to have something that's containing gluten. And then also just make sure that you're not super stressed out. So a lot of times, like, people go on vacation, right? And your stress levels are low and you're eating all these things that you don't usually tolerate, and you can tolerate them. That's part of the thing. Stress is a big factor. So make sure low stress, go for organic, traditionally made sourdough if you're going to have gluten.
Yeah. And the organic will also have a lot less, hopefully none, except there probably will be some glyphosate. Just because the glyphosate, it is spread, even when it's on one part of the farm, it gets spread to the other. So, but hopefully there will be a lot less of those pesticides. So that's another benefit of the organic. So we got onto the last topic, which is, I do have some really favorite. I have eliminated gluten in my diet. My husband has an autoimmune condition. So because of that, we've eliminated gluten in our house. And I have found some really great alternatives.
I'm so excited to hear.
So I'll just go ahead and get started with my first one, sort of just go back and forth. But there is this prepared oatmeal that is now being sold here in Florida at the supermarket Publix. I don't know if you have Publix by you, but
we don't. But when I was living in Florida, I always went to Publix, so I know exactly what you're talking about.
Okay, cool. And but you could also order it online from the company. It's called Eat Mush oatmeal. So EAT, and then mush is MUSH oatmeal. And what I love about this type of oatmeal is, number one, it's gluten-free, but also if you look at the ingredients, I always teach people to look at the ingredient lists of everything they eat. And there's only like 4 or 5 ingredients, and every one of them is a whole food. There's no added preservatives or additives or compounds that you wouldn't recognize. So, and it comes prepackaged. It's so easy to open up in the morning and just add some nuts or seeds or berries to. And it's just a whole really healthy food diet or breakfast.
Nice. That sounds awesome. I've not heard of that, so I'll have to check them out. One of my favorite gluten-free alternatives is coconut aminos. So a lot of soy sauces, as I mentioned earlier, do have gluten. And especially if you're trying to avoid gluten and you're trying to avoid soy, coconut aminos can be a great soy sauce alternative. So I love doing it in stir fries. I pretty much find it's good on anything, even just like rice. I think it's really delicious. It's a little bit sweeter than regular soy sauce, but I love it. So that's one of my favorites.
I love coconut aminos. I almost add every single food that I make. So I totally agree with you. The next one I have on my list is siete fajitas and chips. Their chips are so good. You will never know that there's anything missing or changed in these chips. I use the fajitas that have soft shell and hard shell tacos that I use for tons of my cooking, my fish and meat tacos. And then I've also learned recently that they have these non-dairy like spreads. So like cheddar cheese. And so we haven't gotten into the dairy issue, but if you are also dairy free, then they have some really good non-dairy cheeses, which is a hard thing to find that taste good. So I'm
definitely. I've seen their nacho cheeses, but I haven't tried them yet. So I'm very curious, but I love Siete. They are such an awesome brand. And also, even I saw at Whole Foods, they have their own version of almond flour tortillas and cassava flour tortillas. So,
Yep.
and I think they're even less expensive than the siete. So that's a good option too. And then just in terms of like baking, which I know can be a struggle for people when transitioning to a gluten-free diet, almond flour is probably my favorite gluten-free flour to use just in terms of taste and texture. Coconut flour is another good one. It absorbs a ton of water. So if you read a recipe and it calls for like 2 tablespoons of coconut flour, that's not a typo. It's not like 2 cups or anything. I've made that mistake before. So yeah, coconut flour, and then also cassava flour I really like. So that's another great one. And even now they're making like cauliflower flour, and what's the other one I saw? There was another one that was like crazy, and I was like, I've never heard of that. Chickpea flour is also coming out.
So cool.
So you know, that's the thing with so many more people going gluten-free, is that there's so many more options and people are getting really creative with it. So that's really cool.
Yeah, I agree. There's a pasta that I love. It's called Jovial,
Oh, yes.
Jovial. It is the first gluten-free pasta that cooks exactly like, to me at least, exactly like, you know, regular types of pasta that I've used to eat with gluten. I get that from thrivemarket.com, and that's one of the places that I think we mentioned, you know, in previous podcasts. But yeah, they have all different shapes and types of pasta. So Jovial, Jovial, is the name of that brand.
I just ordered that because I heard someone talking about it, and they were saying they've tried all these gluten-free pastas. They never like rice pasta. And then they said that Jovial was the only rice pasta that they liked. So we're going to try that. I'm really excited because I don't think I've tried it before. Yeah. Is there one that you like most?
I like the fettuccine. I like the farfalle. And then is there another one? I'm trying to remember the name. There's like another one that's like also like a thick fettuccine. I'll have to get back to you on the name of that. But those are my favorites. Yeah.
I'm excited. Another brand I really love is Simple Mills. So they, again, we always want to go for whole foods, but sometimes we do buy processed foods and we just want to make sure the ingredients are good. And Simple Mills is one of those companies that the ingredients are good and it also tastes amazing. So their crackers, they have almond flour crackers that I've been obsessed with. The rosemary, I think it's rosemary and herb one is my favorite. That one is so good. But yeah, Simple Mills has pizza crust. They have pasta, or do they have pasta? I don't think they have pasta, but they have like cookies. So from a box, if you want to make almond flour cookies, you can get that. And the crackers are great. So that's another option I like to tell people. And then Purely Elizabeth is another granola brand. So they're certified gluten-free. So if you're looking for gluten-free oats and gluten-free granola, that can be a good option as well.
I have not heard of either of those. So I just wrote those down. I'm definitely going to check them out. When you were saying Simple Mills, I thought you were going to say Simple Needs, because there's a brand that is called Simple. I mean Simple, and then Needs. So that's spelled Kneads. So Simple Needs bread, and that one it's a must try. All the ingredients are whole food ingredients. It will just be delivered. You just order it online. It gets delivered, and that's my favorite bread replacement.
Awesome. I'll have to check that out. Yeah, I don't think I've heard of that one. We do have a really good gluten-free bakery here in Portland called New Cascadia, which I feel really spoiled that we have this here because it's so good. Yeah, their bread's amazing. And they have a baguette too, which is really good.
I know that. I'm really jealous. I think they're starting to deliver though, if I'm not mistaken.
Oh, nice.
I'll have to look into that. But then the other one that I have for bread is they're called Pagels bagels. So pagels with a P as in Peter, Pagels bagels. And those are awesome. They're not like huge like some of the bagels we've gotten accustomed to eating. So it's a more appropriate size where it doesn't have to fill you up for breakfast on just carbohydrates. But it's a great option. You can keep them in the freezer and then toast them when you want and stuff like that. So that's a good option for the morning.
Awesome. Yeah, the last one I was going to recommend was actually a bread that I told Stacy about last time that I've been making nonstop. And it's called the Life Changing Loaf of Bread, and it's on My New Roots website. And I recommend it to almost everyone. It's gluten-free, whole foods, delicious, super easy to make at home. So if you're up for a little bit of a baking challenge, go ahead and try that at home. It's really delicious.
Yeah, and I'll second that because I took her recommendation and I made that this week. And we've been eating it every single day. We're absolutely obsessed. It's so healthy. It's full of nuts and seeds. And yeah, it's awesome. It's easy to make. So it doesn't get more than that.
Yeah, it is so high in fiber. Speaking of fiber, like we did before, there's psyllium in it, there's flax seeds, there's chia. It's really great.
Yeah, I agree. My very last one is something called Wake Up Waffles. So if you're the type of person that likes waffles or pancakes in the morning, Wake Up Waffles are another thing that just gets delivered to our house. And so obviously my husband likes breakfast.
I do as well. So
breakfast, gluten-free breakfast options. Okay, well, I think that covers it for me.
Yeah.
So I hope that answered a lot of people's questions about why gluten can be harmful for some people, why some people can tolerate it, but some precautions to take regardless, and then some ideas for replacing gluten and also things to think about if you are taking it out of your diet. So
totally.
Great to see you. We'll have
you too.
Soon. Just as a reminder, my name is Stacy Seslowski. You can visit me at my website at www.healfromfood.com, or you could email me stacy@healfromfood.com. And then lastly, you can check me out on social media, Heal From Food.
Awesome. Thanks, Stacy. And I'm Leah Barrick. You can find me online at www.gracefunctionalnutrition.com. And feel free to shoot me an email at gracefunctionalnutrition@gmail.com. And I'm also on social media at Grace Functional Nutrition.
Awesome. See you guys next week.
Bye. Thanks. Yeah. Thanks, Stacy. See ya.
Bye-bye.